Who is the strongest protagonist in the entire GTA franchise? Recently I ran a poll on my community tab where I asked you all who you thought was the strongest among 3 of my top picks, which were Nico Bellic from GTA 4, Carl Johnson from San Andreas, and Trevor Phillips from GTA 5. Out of those 3, the crowd's favorite was Nico. However, many good arguments were made in the favor of the other 2 candidates, as well as a few others that weren't on there, such as Claude or Tony Cipriani. So who is actually the strongest among all of them? And how exactly do we even quantify the strength of a character? Aren't they equally as powerful? Well, in the free roam it might seem that way, but canonically there are lots of factors that make certain protagonists stronger than others. From physical strength, abilities, feats during and prior to the events of their stories, all of them contributed to my decisions when ranking them. So today I'm going to rank most of the protagonists from the series and determine which of them are the strongest, but also which of them are the weakest as well. So let's start this list with the protagonist that went down a path which eventually led to his demise. I'm of course talking about Johnny Klebitz from The Lost and Damned. Now, when I say he's the weakest in the series, I'm obviously taking into account events after his game as well, because we all know his fate all too well. From a respectable and feared leader of the Lost, he became a meth head. During the events of his DLC, he's seen doing a lot of impressive things, like basically wiping the floor with the AODs every chance he gets, but the most impressive feat is breaking into the Alderney State Penitentiary during the mission Get Lost, fighting through multiple waves of well-armed guards, all in order to take out Billy. And although he technically had a bit of help from a few other Lost members, he's definitely done most of the work. But why would I place him dead last? Well, he's one of 2 protagonists that we see in the franchise dying, at least canonically, and I could never place him above others that are still alive most importantly, and second, the other entries on the list had way more impressive feats anyway. No disrespect to Johnny and T-Lad, as I think it's a really solid DLC, especially because of the biker gang theme, but he is the weakest of them all, mostly because of the choices he made which led to his death later on. And the next entry on this list is somewhat similar. Victor Vance is by far one of the most beloved main characters in this franchise, along with others like Nico and CJ, as people believe these guys are very different from someone like Claude, for example, who has no real moral compass and just does things for the money, whereas Victor has boundaries that he won't cross, or at least not initially. Although Vic's story takes us on a similar journey to Tommy's in Vice City, taking over various empires/assets and basically starting their own crime families, Vic's story ends quite pathetically, getting killed in a deal he hesitated to do. Vic is well built physically, has had some military training, he's able to swim unlike Tommy, and their feats are somewhat comparable. And in a fight between these 2, I'd argue in favor of Vic. But one of them is sipping cocktails in Diaz's mansion and the other one is dead. So I have to dock a few points from Vic. Had he stayed alive, he would have been a top 5 character in terms of strength, but again, I cannot rank him above other people that are still alive. Up next, we have Huang Li from Chinatown Wars, a young rich kid that came to Liberty City to seek revenge for the death of his father, and is looking for his killer, putting us through an amazing journey with interesting and unique gameplay loops. And time again, I've said that this game is one of the most underrated in the entire franchise. But I'm not judging the gameplay, I'm judging the protagonist and their feats and abilities. And Huang isn't necessarily a weak character, but he's also not the most impressive in many aspects. His greatest strength is his hand-to-hand combat as well as his agility and general athletic build. In-game, he can basically outrun cars and destroy them with his bare hands, but I'm not sure how much of that is due to his physical prowess and not just the developer's way of making the free roam really silly. If these abilities were canon, he'd basically be number 1 as they are literal superpowers. But again, not everything that the player can seemingly do in the free roam should be taken into account, as almost all of the 3D era protagonists can push around tanks that weigh around 40 to 70 tons. Now circling back to Huang, in terms of agility and hand-to-hand combat, he's probably among the strongest, but that's not enough for him to be ranked higher. Moving on, the next entry on the list is Luis Lopez from The Ballad of Gay Tony. Luis isn't seen doing the most impressive feats during his story, but he did go up against Ray Bulgarin and all of his goons, successfully managing to take all of them out and his drug operation, as well as participating in triathlons and cage fights. He's also a really muscular guy and is able to wield insane weapons like shotguns with explosive rounds and heavy machine guns. Overall, he's not someone to mess with, and I think his rating is fair. Now, how can we properly introduce the next protagonist on this list? Tony Cipriani is a menace in his own game, and this man is really someone not to mess with, even more than Luis. Among his greatest feats, we have wiping out Vincenzo and his crew, Torini and his guys, Paulie Sandako, a whole bunch of Forellis, Kazuki Kaisen, and destroying all of Fort Staunton at the orders of Donald Love, which wasn't necessarily hard, it's just very evil of him. After the events of LCS, Tony seems to have really let himself go, and is definitely past his prime, but you still wouldn't want to get on his nerves. This man is more evil than he's a threat, as he's not really well known for any particular skill. He's not the greatest at shooting, hand combat, or other physical abilities, but he's considerably stronger than others mentioned so far, and the events of LCS clearly demonstrate that. Only 3 years later after that, a new protagonist would show his face in Liberty City and begin showing his skills. And that would be Claude. The man doesn't talk, but he uses his skills to assert dominance. He's relatively equal to Tony, as they have similar feats, abilities, and they basically end up doing the same things throughout their games. Claude is also no stranger to wiping out gang leaders like Kenji, Salvatore Leone, and eventually his ex, Catalina. This guy ends up being basically wanted by the whole criminal underworld of Liberty City, and that's because unlike Tony, who's loyal to the Leones, Claude works for money instead, and he doesn't care where it's from, so long as he's getting paid. I'm unsure if Claude decided to stay in Liberty past the events of GTA 3, as walking down the streets of any neighborhood results in an all-out war. In my eyes, Claude is just ever so slightly stronger than Tony, so I'm going to rank him one spot higher as well. Up next, I have a character that was initially higher up, but after careful consideration, I think Michael belongs somewhere in the middle of this list. I wanted to have him above Franklin, mostly because in-game, his skills are definitely more important for a strength comparison. He's the best at shooting among the 3 protagonists of GTA 5, and that's far more important than Franklin's driving skills. He's also a criminal mastermind, planning and perfectly executing a lot of heists, not just in the game, but also prior to the events of the story. So his intelligence also plays a good role in his ranking. However, Michael's physical appearance takes away from his other skills. He is a middle-aged man similar to Trevor, but he's not really in shape. And I'm not sure he'd last long in a fist fight between him and either of Franklin or Trevor. And speaking of the other protagonists, the following entry is Franklin. During the events of GTA 5, he's in his mid-20s, much younger than the other two, and he's also built really well, having a muscular physique and probably packing a serious punch as well. Unlike Michael, he's not the best at shooting, nor is he the most intelligent, but his youth and body definitely make up for it. And thankfully, because of all the possible endings in GTA 5, we have a decent idea of how we can rank all of the protagonists in terms of strength. In ending B of the game, despite Michael being a much better shooter, it didn't quite help him in his fight with Franklin, and he basically gets bodied trying to defend himself. So between the two of them, the game confirms that Franklin is stronger and can take Michael on his own, which wasn't the same case when dealing with Trevor in ending A, but we'll come back to that a bit later. I'd also like to mention that after more than 10 years after the events of GTA 5, Franklin looks just as good, even better than he did in his mid-20s, and he appears to be doing really well for himself. The upcoming protagonist is another force not to be messed with, and someone who, despite not being able to swim, was capable of taking over an entire city. Of course, we're talking about Tommy Vercetti. Among his greatest feats, we need to talk about the way this man earned his famous nickname, the Hardwood Butcher. In 1971, 15 years before the events of Vice City, Tommy was sent into an ambush by Sonny Forelli, who was his boss at the time, where he was met by 11 hitmen who were sent there to whack him. However, things didn't turn out so well for them, as they all got wiped out by Tommy, who was then arrested and sentenced to life in prison. But with Sonny pulling a few strings, he then received only 15 years, which he ended up serving. Now, 11 people at once is impressive on its own, but again, these weren't just some ordinary thugs, they were hitmen, professionals of the highest tier specializing in the very thing they failed to do, and 11 of them at once is just absurd, yet they weren't enough to take out Tommy. And that's just one feat prior to the events of his game. During the storyline of Vice City, the man ends up taking over Diaz's mansion, all of the major assets in Vice City, and finally stands his ground against Sonny Forelli and all of his goons, as well as Lance, who ends up betraying him, and he walks out unharmed just like he did 15 years ago. Truly impressive if you ask me. Let us now enter the top 3 picks for the strongest protagonists of this franchise, all which were featured in my community poll that I did. Trevor Phillips is an unstoppable maniac, with an unpredictable mind capable of taking out waves and waves of enemies single-handedly and walking out unfazed. A lot of people argued in favor of Trevor as being the strongest, mainly because of his special ability, which makes him invulnerable for a short period of time and increases the damage he puts out. Now, there's a few problems with this. First of all, the special abilities in GTA 5 as well as Red Dead are meant to showcase the skill of the protagonist rather than them being some sort of superpower they each have. With Franklin's special ability, it's meant to demonstrate how skilled of a driver he is, and similarly, Michael's special ability does the same. He's not magically able to slow down time when shooting, it's just a way for the player to land more accurate and impressive shots, making it so Michael is the greatest shooter among the three protagonists. Okay, but how does becoming invulnerable showcase any of Trevor's skills? Well, he is indeed the strongest and craziest of the trio, however, he's not magically becoming invulnerable when he's angry. His ability is somewhat representing his lifestyle and drug habits, as Trevor is a frequent meth user. But unlike Johnny, who became a zombie because of it, Trevor's meth addiction turns him into an unstoppable machine, where bullet hits don't affect him in the sense that he probably doesn't feel any pain, thus giving the illusion of invincibility. But with that in mind, I've talked about how Franklin was able to take out Michael on his own in Ending B. However, in Ending A, Franklin wasn't able to take out Trevor by himself and required the help of Michael halfway through the mission in order to stop Trevor for good, which means it took two whole protagonists to stop and kill him. And it's not as if after him and Michael crashed their cars that he became unable to fight. He simply gave up and accepted his fate, feeling betrayed and like nobody in the world cares for him. Number 2 on my list will be controversial considering that an overwhelming majority agree that he's actually number 1, but that will be Niko Bellic. Now don't get me wrong, this man is an absolute unit. He's a war veteran who served in the army and participated in the Yugoslavian wars. He's received training in piloting helicopters, driving tanks, and remember, he was only a teenager during that time. So that makes it much more impressive. Then, after arriving in Liberty City, he worked his way up to increasingly difficult jobs for various characters we meet in the game. From the Russian mob to the 5 families that are part of the Commission and the addition of the Pegorinos, as well as working for the IAA, which is a government agency mind you, Niko's done it all. He's also a really skilled shooter and his fighting style in the game is Krav Maga, or however it's pronounced, a form of martial arts derived from judo, karate, boxing and many others with a focus on real life situations that can happen. So to sum it all up, he's a former military, trained to use his fists really well, has the ability to maneuver helicopters and tanks decently, has been working with all types of criminals and even a government agency, doing really dangerous jobs for them all, and wiped the floor with the Pegorinos and Dimitri's organizations. What could you possibly want more from this man? Well, since he's number 2, there's a certain someone else that has the edge on him. But don't mistake that as me calling Niko weak in any capacity. Rockstar accidentally or intentionally made the number 1 entry the strongest protagonist of the GTA franchise. It's none other than Carl Johnson, who was the second most voted option in the poll, but who I personally think is number 1 for a multitude of reasons. He might not have received military training in his early life, but CJ has been a gang member since as far back as he can remember, and he was no stranger to the atrocities that can happen in that lifestyle. During the story, we end up traveling across the state of San Andreas, and the difficulty of the tasks only increases as we progress. From simple drive-bys in East Los Santos, we end up exiled from that city. On our quest to seek revenge for the betrayal of Big Smoke and Ryder, we end up taking out the entirety of the Loco Syndicate, which includes Ryder, but also T-Bone Mendez, leader of the San Fierro Rifas, Jizzy B, who owns the Pleasure Domes Club, and Mike Torino, who we don't actually take out, but rather find out that he's actually a government agent. Then we reach the desert segment where we end up doing a bunch of really difficult jobs, like taking out an airplane full of government agents from a rival department. Or how about stealing a jet from a naval base full of armed soldiers, and receiving professional pilot training in the flight school mission before all of that occurs. But those aren't the craziest things we do in this game, as we end up stealing a jetpack from the most secluded and really well defended army bases in the entire franchise, that being Area 69. And that's not all, because after returning to Los Santos, we're required to take over at least half of Los Santos from the Balas and Vagos, then start the final mission in which we fight our way through Big Smoke's cracked den to get rid of him. Just the storyline alone is crazy and is probably making Carl a good enough matchup for Niko, but let's also talk about the important aspects of the free roam. CJ is the only character that can have drastic physical changes during the game. You can transform CJ from a scrawny kid to a massive steroid user. Well, he doesn't use steroids, but his maxed out muscle stat sure looks like it. And unlike Niko, who's versed into Krav Maga only, CJ can learn 3 different fighting styles in the game. If that doesn't make him the strongest of them all, honestly I don't know what to say. I've skipped over protagonists from the 2D era games, as well as Mike from GTA Advance, and oh, who could forget the GTA Online protagonist who's been kicking ass in Los Santos for over 10 years. But what do you think? Is the list fair and accurate, or would you have placed the characters in a different order? Let me know in the comment section down below, and while you're there, also leave a like. And of course, consider subscribing if you want to see more. Thank you so much for watching.